There's a somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be someone who'll watch over me. A little lamb who's lost in the wood. I know I could always be good to one who'll watch over me.
The most modern, the most beautiful, the fastest passenger ship in the world, the SS United States.
The SS United States is America's flagship. She smashed the transatlantic speed record on her maiden voyage in 1952, a record that I suspect will never be broken. She was an iconic symbol of this nation's post-war sense of pride, patriotism, purpose.
I'm Arthur Piccolo here in Lower Manhattan, where SS United States, the greatest ship ever built, was conceived, designed, and her construction managed by William Francis Gibbs and his firm. This is the fifth in a continuing series of videos I have produced in support of the rebuilding and full restoration of SS United States to her original glory, even better for the 21st century. She had her maiden voyage July 4th, 1952, here from New York City, sailing majestically into New York Harbor, bound for England to crush the all-time speed record for transatlantic crossings, and to do it again, setting the westbound speed record a few days later. Records that will never be broken by any ocean liner. In returning to her home port of New York City for a ticker tape parade in her honor, her crew, and William Francis Gibbs on July 18, 1952, beginning here at Bowling Green.
Hi there. Crossing on Time is my first attempt to sort of combine a little autobiography, history, writing history, which I, sort of try to avoid, technology, building a ship, and biography, telling the story of the designer and builder of the ship, the United States. Telling that story because it's the ship that carried my mother and brother and sister and I across the Atlantic in 1957. And a young boy named William Francis Gibbs is taken to the shipyard by his father, along with his brother Frederick, William Francis is 8 years old and his brother is 6, to see the launch of the St. Louis. Might have remembered, but it made an impression. From that point on, Gibbs was committed to the idea of becoming involved with ships and hopefully eventually building one. So this is where it went, working on a drafting table. What Frederick is doing while William Francis is designing what he hopes will be the largest, fastest, and biggest American-built ship ever. Frederick is figuring out the numbers. He's the accountant here, but he's also sort of planning the larger picture. How many ships will they need? Where will they dock this thing? What can they do to make the experience for their passengers different? So this is part of Gibbs's education, and it's part of why he was so successful. He never avoided an opportunity to learn about what other people who build ships do and why. But this is how he's learning. His real desire, of course, though, is to build this biggest ship He was in his late 20s when he started on that. We're probably into the 30s now, late 30s. And these are the ships that in his mind he is competing with. The European ships. It's always the European ships. And they never give up the blue riband, you know, the award, the honor for having been the fastest ship moving from east to west across the Atlantic. Ships. Gibbs is, at this point, the Gibbs Company is working for the Navy, designing all these vessels for the war, Second World War now. And he's learning a ton of stuff. He's certainly got access to the most up-to-date information and so on and so forth. So that fills much of his life. And what he really wants to be doing is he wants to be doing passenger liners because that's really, you know, the dream. So he designs the America, 1938. And no sooner do they get this thing launched and ready to go than it is taken over by the U.S. Navy for troop carrying because of the war in 1940. So it gets painted gray. So this illustration was one of those images that had to say lots of things. Had to talk about the Navy a little bit, the boys running their business, the ship they created, and the surprise that the ship received once it was launched. Shortly thereafter, though, 44, 45, 46, he's given the commission to design a bigger ship. This ship would, and safely carry them, and very quickly. It was designed and kept narrow enough so that it could go through the Panama Canal, so they could cut through to the Pacific Ocean, just in case something should happen on the Korean Peninsula. The engineering inside it, the engines, the boilers, and so on and so forth, again, the most complex. A double hull, compartmentalized, 20 compartments now. The plans for each of the decks, the drafting room below. Now we can actually build it. Now we have plans. We build it in a dry dock. That blue thing is a caisson. It's basically a hollow steel box that rests against the end of this bathtub. And once it's in place, the river will push against it and keep it from moving. But once it's in place, you can actually take the water out, pump the water out of the dry dock itself, and you've got a space in which you can build a ship. Here's a different view. I decided that earlier view didn't work that well. It was too confusing and didn't show enough. So redraw, and there it is, ready to go. All the pieces of the United States were sub-assemblies. All the small parts were put together in bigger parts, and then all the big parts were piled on top of each other and welded together in an appropriate fashion in the dry dock. There's a little piece on top. That's the right-hand side. That's the keel, the first section of the keel that'll run down the entire 990 feet. Well, not quite that much, but early sketch, quick pencil drawing. There's that piece of the keel being lowered. Here's another version of it. I'm always moving around trying to find the best point of view, the point of view that I think will be most interesting, but will also make the information as clear as possible. That's the goal. It has to be dramatic, but it has to be accurate and it has to be engaging. Nobody said it was going to be easy, however. So here's the drawing inside the dry dock with that piece of the keel being lowered into place. And this is an integrated crew, or at least an African-American white mixed crew of shipbuilders in Newport News, Virginia at the time. Never really were sure whether either of those two segments of the working population were given different tasks specifically. So I decided to take advantage of the fact that they're all wearing gloves because they're working with steel. And so you have no idea whose hand that is, what color it may be. It may be God's hand, I don't know. But I needed a little place for text on this page, so that piece of paper has text on it in the book. Another hand coming in to lower a piece of the side of the ship, the inner hull, and then the outer hull will be welded into place on the outside, and riveted actually. The center section of the ship divided into compartments, the boiler being lowered into place, the stern of the ship with the rudder assembly and the motor necessary, the engine necessary to actually just turn the rudder because of the size of these things. Propeller shafts being fed into the bossings, which lead eventually to tunnels which connect to the engine rooms. There's more here than you could ever possibly want to know. And I've been struggling to try to squeeze it into as few pages as possible so that even someone who didn't think they could be interested in this kind of technology might just relent and figure, well, it's not that long, let's just go along for the ride. The bow, heavily reinforced. The anchor housing and the machinery necessary to raise and lower the 3 anchors. The center section, now we're putting in the pieces of the engine room. And on top, that yellowish area on top, that's all aluminum. The bulk of the hull is steel, but everything above the promenade deck is made of aluminum to cut the weight. So again, it didn't have to be that strong. It didn't have to be as strong as steel because it was not resisting the pounding of the waves. In the foreground, also made of aluminum, are the 2 smokestacks, which were sort of iconic of Gibbs's ships. And the top cap is being put on one of the stacks here. And eventually they will be cut in half, not vertically but horizontally, and lifted on board in 2 pieces. They're just too big to be handled by the cranes, even at Newport News. Down below, the propellers are being installed on the ends of the shafts, which emerge just enough from the bossings of the hull. This was to be my rough sketch. And this sometimes happens too. But I knew I couldn't make a better drawing of this situation, so I just decided to clean it up. See these things grow. Finally, the day comes. Gibbs is sitting there on the caisson. He's watching them flood the dry dock. It is no longer a dry dock. Once it's full, the ship will have lifted off its wooden supports, and the caisson can be filled, which is now full of water, can be emptied, and it will float and pop free at the end of the dry dock and can be pulled away, and you now are connected to the river, to the James River. First sketch, you know, the typical kind of launch thing, bunting on the podium, or a band, hundreds of people sweating down there at Newport News, listening to speeches and all that sort of stuff. It was broadcast around the country. So it was a pretty big event, a national event. I decided that that's what I should do, but I changed my mind. I decided to show what the launch would be like from underneath the water. Now we have this huge 900-foot-long hull floating, 12 feet above the wooden structure on which it has rested for a year and a half as it's been constructed. You could just see a little bit of red, white, and blue through the water. But I thought this was much more. I mean, you'd say, what is this? And that's the most important question I could get you to ask. We have to do a lot of stuff inside, lifeboats, extra generators, safety features, doors that close automatically, then build out the cabins. This all happens in a dock about some short distance from where the ship was built. Here's the finished engine room. Here's the bridge during the sea trials. And here's the payoff for those of you who have actually read the story to this point and just can't believe this can go on any longer. Well, it doesn't actually go on any longer. So we open those pages and we have a fold-out spread that's about 5 feet long. I wanted it to be much wider than the book itself, so it would be a surprise. And but everything's in there. Missing dog, the different sort of dining rooms and all that sort of stuff. And finally, the ship that would carry us to the U.S.
It's extraordinary that the ship has been sitting here in Philadelphia now. She was withdrawn from service back in 1969. Still inspires so much creativity, sparks such passionate responses on the part of whether it's former passengers, former crew members, or artists, photographers, dancers, musicians. There's something about this ship that calls to people.
Time is running out for SS United States, but we can make this happen. Have her become the symbolic centerpiece in New York Harbor, magnificently restored for our nation's 250th anniversary, July 4th, 2026. If enough of us care and make it happen.